What is going on, everybody? So, with the Nintendo Switch 2 arriving in just a month, we're here to count down the days by uploading a Nintendo Switch 2 video every single week at the very least. And of course, I wanted to boycott Nintendo Switch 2, but I'm still excited for the hardware overall. I think that this system is going to be absolutely incredible, especially the fact that it's using an NVIDIA Tegra CPU with a VRR HDR screen at 1080p. Now, a lot of people think that the 1080p screen shouldn't be supported, or Nintendo should have just jumped to an OLED panel similar to Steam Deck OLED. But I believe that the 1080p screen will make a difference with older Nintendo Switch games, especially with DLSS upscaling with the Nintendo Switch 2. But the main question that I'm going to ask today is, do you think the Nintendo Switch 2 will make the Nintendo Switch 1 obsolete? I, for one, do not, especially if you have a Nintendo Switch Lite. These things can actually fit in your pocket. Unlike the Nintendo Switch 2, the Lite is a pocketable handheld. It's not a hybrid like the 2, but it is an increasingly useful handheld in terms of portability. And I've been having way more fun with the Lite than I did with the Nintendo Switch 1, mainly because of the smaller screen. I think that 720p looks like 1080p with a screen at this size. I believe that the screen is only 4 inches, so it's incredibly small, but the screen size is just one factor to put into account with the Switch Lite. It's the console size itself. This thing can run full Nintendo Switch games like Doom 2016, Tears of the Kingdom, Breath of the Wild, at such a tiny form factor. Hell, you could even play games like Batman Arkham Knight on the go with a pocketable system like the Nintendo Switch Lite. But of course, in terms of hardware, the Nintendo Switch 2 is 10 times more powerful than the 1, and especially the Lite. So you're going to be looking at hardware that is a lot more powerful than the first iteration. But the same could be said about the Steam Deck, ROG Ally, and Legion Go. Those are about 20 times more powerful than the Nintendo Switch, but you don't see a lot of people going to those because when it comes to handhelds, most people don't care about power. They only care about convenience and portability. And with the Lite, you get both because you can just cancel your game, go back into it in 1 second, turn off your system, and turn it back on and resume your game in a second. So this handheld is incredibly convenient compared to others, especially like the Steam Deck and ROG Ally. Steam Deck is very convenient. I have to admit that. It feels very similar to a Nintendo Switch, but in terms of reliability, the Steam Deck has a lot less reliability than something like a Nintendo Switch. The convenience is still there with something like a Steam Deck, but overall, my Nintendo Switch personally has never crashed on any game. And especially at this software version, the Nintendo Switch is more reliable than it has ever been in the last 8 years. So do I think the Nintendo Switch 1 and the Lite is obsolete compared to the 2? Hell no. I think that the 2 can be considered a little more obsolete than the Nintendo Switch 1, considering that you have systems that are a lot more powerful and portable, like the Nintendo Switch Lite, the Steam Deck, ROG Ally. The Nintendo Switch 2 is a bit late in the game in terms of powerhouse handhelds. You have systems out there that can do so much more and can play a lot more games at 4K than something like a Nintendo Switch 2, which is mostly going to play games at 1440p, which is not a bad thing. I love 1440p, especially if it's 60 FPS. But unfortunately, there are handheld systems that are way more powerful. So if Nintendo is leading with the 2 being a powerhouse and considerably more powerful than the Switch 1, then that's not a very good place to start because it makes it more obsolete than the original Switch in terms of portability and power, especially with all of these crazy rules that are being thrown at us with the Nintendo Switch 2, with the game key cards, upgrade packs, Nintendo Switch 2 editions, and so many more variables that are being thrown at the Nintendo Switch 2 that makes something like a Nintendo Switch 1 look like a godsend compared to Nintendo Switch 2, especially for the fact that we actually have physical games that work day one. So most likely a lot of people are going to be disappointed with the Nintendo Switch 2 come day one, considering most of their games might have issues. And I doubt that Nintendo fully tested over 20,000 games physically and digitally on the Nintendo Switch 2, and most likely that graph is a load of BS. I mean, they're saying that the green represents games that work and the red represents games that don't. Hey, look, there's a little tiny sliver. Well, there's 20,000 games, so considering there's a little tiny sliver, even that is a bit alarming, but we're not getting, for the most part, the exact numbers of games that work, but instead we're getting games that absolutely do not start or convey issues. And sure, we could take Nintendo's word for it that most games are going to work on the Nintendo Switch 2, but they have lied to us before, especially with the newest update, 20.0.0, where it takes away the primary and secondary users and exchanges it for game share and digital game cards. So if you're trying to take Nintendo's word for it, this is probably the worst time to do so, especially when it comes to over 20,000 liabilities like their library. So you might want to keep a Nintendo Switch 1. In fact, you might want to keep something like a Steam Deck and ROG Ally close at hand, because the Nintendo Switch 2 might be a little more complicated than even those, since Nintendo is still using a translation layer on top of the Nintendo Switch 2, similar to something like a Steam Deck with Proton and playing Windows 11 games. So in terms of power, the Switch 2 isn't very different than something like a Steam Deck and ROG Ally. Let's just get that straight, because Nintendo was working on the Switch 2 as soon as they finished the Nintendo Switch 1, so they didn't have the most advanced hardware readily available to them. In fact, they're still using an NVIDIA Tegra chip. But that isn't the main reason why the Switch 1 isn't obsolete compared to the Nintendo Switch 2. Of course, it is the convenience, portability, and the fact that you can still get physical games for the Nintendo Switch 1. So keep supporting the Nintendo Switch 1, because there's going to be a lot more physical games, and it's not going to have that crazy game key card thing that the Nintendo Switch 2 has. So right now, more than ever, the Nintendo Switch 1 and Lite is looking like the greatest handheld of all time, especially considering what the future holds for future Nintendo hardware. I think it is a bit of a tragedy that Nintendo is going the route that they're going with Nintendo Switch 2. It is very unfortunate that game key cards will be very common opposed to physical games, and there's going to be a ton of consumer confusion in terms of where to get your games, what kind of games can upgrade for free or for $20, exactly which games are going to be physical. And I think customer confusion is something that's going to work against the Nintendo Switch 2 way more than the fact that there are more powerful handhelds out there and that the Nintendo Switch 1 is a lot more portable than the 2. Even though the 2 is very light in comparison with handhelds like the Steam Deck and ROG Ally, we still have the Nintendo Switch Lite, which is the lightest handheld in comparison to what it can do compared to any other handheld on the market. Of course, you can get something like an Aya Neo-kun or something even lighter than that on the market, but they are Windows devices, and their convenience is nothing compared to something like a Lite or even a Nintendo Switch 1. But we'll see how everything unfolds with the Nintendo Switch 2 and exactly how everybody likes it. I'm sure it's going to be a lot more convenient than the Steam Deck, because Nintendo is a billion-dollar company and they can afford to make a handheld just as powerful as it is convenient. So yeah, guys, let me know what you think about the Nintendo Switch 1 being obsolete compared to a Nintendo Switch 2. I still think that a ton of people are going to buy the Nintendo Switch 1, and especially the fact that this handheld is going to lower in price by a huge margin after the Nintendo Switch 2 releases. Of course, that's going to be the new hot tech on the market, and the Switch 2 is just going to be some old tech. But that's going to make this thing have in price compared to something like a Nintendo Switch 2. You're going to be able to get one of these for around $100 to maybe even $80, which is so much of a steal considering how many games are available for the Nintendo Switch 1 and how convenient and massive the library currently is for a Nintendo Switch 1. But yeah, guys, thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. Later.